Welcome to Yemen. Not exactly your typical vacation spot, right? Well, for years, Yemen has been a land of ancient history and stunning landscapes, but also of modern conflict. And right at the heart of this conflict, stirring up headlines and tensions, is a group called the Houthis. So, who are the Houthis? Well, they're not your average rebel group. Think of them as part religious movement, part regional military powerhouse, and kind of part political machine. They started off back in the 1990s just as a small religious and social group, really focused on preserving their beliefs and culture. Over years, though, they've evolved into one of Yemen's most influential and feared forces. Now, if you're wondering why a rebel group from a country on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula matters to the rest of the world, think about this. Yemen sits right next to one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, so when things get heated there, it's not just Yemen that feels it. It's global trade, regional politics, and sometimes even your next fill up at the pump. Recently, the Houthis have been attacking ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, areas that handle millions of barrels of oil every day. I mean, picture this. You're a shipping company trying to get oil through these waters, and then, bam, Houthi drones and missiles swoop in, making things, complicated. But it doesn't end there. The Houthis are now tangled up with international players. We're talking US, Israeli, and even UK airstrikes hitting their positions, each with its own strategic goals. Let's just say they're not exactly on friendly terms right now with the Houthis. And if all of this wasn't enough, there are reports that the Houthis may have partnerships with groups like Al-Qaeda. Yes, one of the most notorious terrorist groups around, possibly teaming up with one of the more powerful groups in Yemen, which makes this whole situation a global hotbed of, well, let's call it complicated alliances. So in today's video, we're diving into all things Houthi, who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, and what it means to Yemen, the Middle East, and even the impact here in the United States. Ready? Let's go. All right, so let's rewind a bit. The Houthis didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Their story begins back in the 1990s when Yemen was facing political and cultural upheaval. Back then, a group of Zaidi Shia Muslims in northern Yemen felt their way of life was being sidelined. They started what was supposed to be a peaceful movement focusing on preserving their religious identity and protecting their community from external influence. They called themselves Ansar Allah, or Supporters of God, which is a pretty intense name, all things considered. And while they initially focused on cultural and religious goals, Yemen's changing political climate, plus outside influence, turned them into a much stronger, much more militant force. Fast forward then to the 2000s, things really start to get real. The Houthis transformed from a social movement into a political and military powerhouse, seizing more and more territory. They were no longer just the defenders of Zaidi culture, they became an armed group with a mission to reshape Yemen's politics. And as they gained power, they also made a few, let's say, strategic friends. One of their biggest supporters? Iran. Yeah, the same Iran that's often in headlines for its own conflicts in the Middle East. Now, while the Houthis and Iran are both Shia, they're actually different branches. But in Yemen, Iran sees a chance to stick it to their regional rival, Saudi Arabia, which supports the Yemeni government. It's a bit of a my enemy's enemy is my friend type situation. Now, by 2014, the Houthis were strong enough to make their biggest move yet. They marched into Yemen's capital, Sana'a, and took control, sending the Yemeni government packing. Since then, they've controlled much of northern Yemen, setting up their own systems, collecting taxes, and running local administrations. These days, the Houthis operate almost like their own state within a state. They have their own media channels, they control resources, and have a pretty well-trained and, all things considered, well-equipped military wing. And with Iran's support, they actually have access to more advanced weapons, including missiles and drones. So that's who the Houthis are, a group that started with humble cultural roots, but has evolved into a serious power player with some pretty ambitious goals. They want influence in Yemen, they're anti-Saudi, anti-American, and anti-Israeli, and they're definitely not shy about using force to try to get what they want. And that's just scratching the surface. Next up, let's dive into what the Houthis are actually doing on the ground, both in Yemen and, as we'll see, in waters and skies beyond it. Hey, real quick, I'm going to do you a favor and you can thank me later. You know how for some friends and family, it's always hard to figure out what to get them for Christmas? I've got your solution this year. A Ridge wallet, or key case. Hear me out. If any of you are like me, then you use your wallet every single day until it's kind of fallen apart at the seams, and then put off actually buying a new one for another 6 to 12 months, which means that is the perfect setup for a Christmas gift. Something your friends and family will use, probably need, but drag their feet on ever buying for themselves. I mean, have you ever given someone a gift that they open up and say, yes, I needed this? I'm telling you, Ridge wallets are right in that sweet spot. Now, personally, I went pretty basic here, but Ridge has a ton of really cool designs and options to choose from. Of course, they've got all your favorite professional sports teams, and if they'd get an Army logo in their collegiate design, I'd definitely have to pick that up. Maybe after Army makes the college football playoff, we'll get our own Ridge wallet. Fingers crossed. But no matter which option you go with, all Ridge wallets fit easily in your front pocket, can hold up to 12 cards, and have room for cash with a cash strap or money clip. All Ridge wallets also feature RFID blocking materials to keep your personal information safe and are made from durable materials, providing excellent protection while remaining lightweight. So head to the link in the description and get up to 47% off the best holiday gift this year, and thank you to Ridge for sponsoring this video. So the Houthis today are far more than a local group. They've transformed into a powerful, heavily armed force with a mission that stretches well beyond Yemen. Recently, their influence has spilled over into regional conflicts with high-profile missile and drone launches into Israeli territory and a bold show of support for Gaza and the Palestinian cause. This isn't just rhetoric. They're backing up their words with actions. In the last few weeks alone, the Houthis have reportedly launched multiple missile and drone strikes towards Israel, signaling their commitment to the, quote, axis of resistance that includes groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. This axis opposes what they see as Western and Israeli aggression across the region, and for the Houthis, these attacks are part of showing solidarity with Gaza. They've taken a stance, making it clear that they'll act militarily in support of Palestine if they feel it's needed. But it's not just Israel feeling the effects. The Houthis have intensified their attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, launching over 30 strikes on commercial vessels and strategic targets in the past year alone. These waters are critical for global trade, and the Houthis know it. Every attack creates ripples in global oil prices, disrupts shipping routes, and drives up security costs for companies operating in the region. It's the Houthis' way of showing that they can influence events far beyond Yemen's borders. These Houthi strikes have drawn a strong response. In recent months, both the United States and Israel have conducted airstrikes in Yemen, targeting Houthi military facilities and missile sites. These airstrikes are meant to weaken the Houthis' growing capabilities and reduce their regional threat. However, each strike also risks escalating the conflict as the Houthis have promised retaliation if these attacks continue. And while these airstrikes target military assets, they also have significant impacts on Yemen's civilians, causing collateral damage and forcing even more people to flee. For the Houthis, however, this is all part of their larger strategy. Standing up against major powers like the United States and Israel makes them look like defenders of the region, not just fighters for Yemen. So the Houthis have gone from a local movement to a group with serious regional reach. They're launching attacks on Israel, disrupting global trade and withstanding international airstrikes, all in the name of supporting Palestine and challenging Western influence. So the Houthis are making waves, literally and figuratively. In recent years, they've shifted from local skirmishes to attacks with international impact, targeting shipping routes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. These are some of the busiest maritime routes in the world, carrying millions of barrels of oil every day. So when the Houthis start firing missiles and launching drones at vessels, it doesn't just create local chaos, it gets the world's attention. I mean, picture this. You're a shipping captain cruising through these waters with a load of goods, and suddenly, boom, a Houthi drone shows up on the radar. The Houthis have developed impressive long-range capabilities, including drones and missiles that can reach targets far beyond Yemen's borders. For them, this isn't just about making headlines. It's a way to disrupt their enemies, namely Saudi Arabia and its allies, and to signal that they're a serious regional player. So why does this matter to the rest of the world? Well, aside from the obvious dangers to shipping crews, attacks on these trade routes mean higher insurance rates, delays, and potentially even rising oil prices. If a major oil tanker gets hit or even threatened, it sends a ripple through global markets. Imagine fuel prices climbing because of a Houthi missile strike in the Red Sea. It's not exactly great news for anyone going to fill up their gas tank. Now, these attacks have brought international players into the mix too. We're talking airstrikes from the United States, Israel, and the UK targeting Houthi positions all across Yemen. Each of these countries has its own reasons for getting involved. For the United States, it's about securing global trade routes and checking Iran's influence in the region. Israel sees the Houthis as an extension of Iran's power and a potential threat near their territory. And for the United Kingdom, it's largely about protecting trade and their long-standing alliances in the Gulf. With each attack, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden are becoming even more militarized. You've got U.S. and allied ships patrolling these waters, and now Israeli forces keeping an eye out too. It's like a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Every time a drone or missile is launched, tensions spike, and the possibility of a major escalation looms a little closer. And here's the kicker. Every attack and every response fuels the Houthis' message. They get to say, look, we're powerful enough to provoke the biggest military players. It's a show of strength, and for a group that once started out as a small movement, it's quite the transformation. But it also means that the stakes keep getting higher and the risks more widespread. Bottom line, the Houthis are no longer just a local group fighting for control in Yemen. Their actions now have global consequence with ripple effects that reach far beyond the Middle East. And as long as these attacks continue, the conflict risks drawing in even more and more international players, each with their own interests and agendas. But that's not the end of it. There are rumors of alliances between the Houthis and other extremist groups, which could make the situation even more volatile. Let's take a look. Now, if the Houthis weren't already in the spotlight enough, there's a twist. In Yemen's complex conflict, the Houthis have occasionally crossed paths with extremist groups like Al-Qaeda. a group that is usually on a mission to destroy anyone in their way. So how does a Shia-affiliated group like the Houthis end up with any connection to Sunni extremists? We'll come up with a new phrase. How about the enemy of my enemy is my temporary ally? Kind of works here. So starting with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, this group has been a major player in Yemen for years. They're notorious not only for local attacks, but also for planning international operations. AQAP considers the Houthis enemies, partly because of their sectarian divide, but mostly because of their power struggles within Yemen. So it's not that the Houthis and Al-Qaeda are best buddies, they're rivals, competing factions, both vying for influence in Yemen. That said, Yemen's chaotic battle lines mean that sometimes even sworn enemies find a reason to work together. In some areas, reports suggest that the Houthis and Al-Qaeda may have struck temporary truces or look the other way arrangements. Why? Well, both groups have a mutual interest in kicking out the Saudi-led coalition. It's one of those we'll ignore you if you ignore us type situations where both groups quietly agree to stay out of each other's way so they can focus on the bigger fight. Now, does this mean that the Houthis have an official alliance with extremist groups? Not quite, but these shifting dynamics highlight just how messy the situation in Yemen really is. One moment, a group like Al-Qaeda might be clashing with the Houthis. The next, they're ignoring each other if it serves their interests. And to make it even more confusing, each of these groups has its own backers, each with different motives. Iran might support the Houthis, but they'd hardly want to see Al-Qaeda gaining ground. The Saudis are backing the government, but they also have their own interests to consider when it comes to these extremists. So what does this mean for Yemen? It means a conflict where alliances are constantly shifting, where today's rival might be tomorrow's uneasy ally. And as long as these groups coexist, even in an agree to disagree way, the conflict remains unpredictable and the stakes stay high. Next, we're turning to the people caught in the middle of this conflict. For Yemeni civilians, these alliances and rivalries are more than just headlines, they're life or death. We've covered the Houthis' rise, their tactics, and their international reach, but there's a tragic reality that often goes overlooked: the impact on everyday Yemenis. For them, this conflict isn't just politics, it's a daily struggle to survive. And humanitarian crisis? It's catastrophic, affecting nearly every aspect of civilian life. Yemen is facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Over 24 million people, about 80% of the population, need humanitarian assistance. Food and medical supplies are scarce, and with blockades and restrictions, even aid can't get through reliably. It's estimated that over 2 million children suffer from acute malnutrition, and thousands are dying from preventable diseases simply because they can't get the care that they need. With healthcare facilities destroyed or severely understaffed, hospitals are overwhelmed. Medicine is scarce, and doctors are forced to make heartbreaking decisions about who gets treated. Imagine having a loved one who needs urgent care, but there simply aren't enough resources to go around. That's daily life for many Yemenis. But the humanitarian crisis isn't just about shortages, it's also about abuses. There are credible reports that the Houthis have engaged in forced labor, essentially using civilians as slaves. These individuals are forced into harsh conditions, often building fortifications, or even handling dangerous tasks like transporting weapons, with little to no regard for their safety. It's a brutal reminder of how civilians are treated as disposable resources in this conflict. And then, of course, there are the reports of sexual violence. Houthi forces have been accused of committing serious sexual crimes, especially against women and girls in vulnerable communities. Some survivors have reported being assaulted by Houthi fighters, often in situations where they felt powerless to resist. These crimes are not only traumatic for the victims, but create a climate of fear and shame in communities already devastated by war. Families are left shattered with limited or no access to justice or any kind of support. Many Yemenis have no choice but to flee these horrors, abandoning their homes to seek refuge in camps with relatives or other parts of the country. But these camps are overcrowded with limited sanitation, food, and safety. For many, it's just a new form of hardship. They've escaped violence only to face hunger, disease, and lack of basic resources. The sad truth is that for the civilians of Yemen, the crisis has no easy end in sight. The conflict has dragged on, and with each day, the human toll deepens. The world's attention might shift, but for Yemenis, the struggle is relentless. They're caught in a conflict not of their making, suffering under the weight of violence, scarcity, and abuses with no clear path to peace. Yemen isn't just a political chessboard. It's a home to millions who deserve dignity and safety. And as long as this conflict rages on, they'll continue to pay the price. In the end, the biggest victims of this war are the ordinary people whose lives have been torn apart. So that's the story of Yemen's conflict, a story of power, alliances, and suffering. We've seen how the Houthis rose from a small movement to a major power, how their reach has stretched beyond Yemen's borders, and how their fight has drawn in some of the world's biggest players. But at the heart of this, as always, are the people of Yemen, caught in a crisis that seems impossible to escape. Yemen might seem like a distant problem to the outside world, but the implications are closer than they appear. The Houthis' actions have shown us how a local group can shape global trade routes, impact oil prices, and affect regional security. Their alliances, especially with Iran and the potential ties with extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, make this conflict one that pulls in interest and forces from all around the globe. But beyond geopolitics, Yemen is a humanitarian tragedy that calls for the world's attention. With millions on the brink of starvation, basic human rights ignored, and abuses on the rise, Yemen is facing a crisis that can't be ignored. Civilians need access to food, healthcare, and most importantly, safety. So why does Yemen matter? Because what's happening there is a test of our global responsibility. It's about recognizing the real cost of conflict and the value of peace. If the world can come together to seek a resolution, there might be hope for a different future for Yemen. So next time you hear about Yemen, remember the stakes. Behind every headline, there's a story, a family, a life that deserves a chance at peace. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.